record on this computer. I think we're recording now. Cool. So moving on to some of these other questions in here. Hopefully we'll have another example on the recording to look at with a separate folder in the views. How would one implement a form partial that is used across the site like a search bar? So the reason I would consider this kind of related to this other question is maybe we have a search bar that is going to be used in like an artist edit form, and also, or I don't know why it would be, but you know, for the sake of the example, maybe something in artists and then also something in songs. We could put that search bar partial in the shared directory and then call that wherever we need it in any category or any directory of the views. Cool. So say in the context of a project, our partial is more of an organizational tool. So we'd want to prioritize functionality of the app first and then incorporate partials if time. Yes, I would agree with the second part of this question. It can be a way to dry up your code. It can be a way to just make a very complicated view more readable. But if I wouldn't necessarily be building a partial before I have the functionality for that view working, if it were me. Yeah, I think that just the basic functionality and expectations of the user stories are more important. That being said, especially in the project we're working on right now, you might have some views that get really gnarly or get really complicated and are just difficult to read. So at that point, I would start thinking about a partial as a way to move forward with refactors there, assuming there's time. Okay. Can we talk about testing partials? Do I need to test them everywhere they're used or just once? The testing process should not change significantly. I would still approach testing as like thinking about the user experience. So the user might not know that the edit form and the new form are both using a partial, but the user does know that when they fill it out and they click a certain button that they expect to see a certain behavior on the site. And I would continue testing that way. Yeah, we don't specifically have a way to test that we're using a partial is another way of looking at that. We're continuing to test the user behavior. Molly, any follow up on some of this?
Yeah, just to clarify on that. So that means you would have like basically the same test for it that you would just functionally have in two different places for your edit and create page.
Yeah, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. Cool. I know there's like another post-it note here, but I do want to like pause and ask if anybody has follow up on any of the stuff I've covered so far with these Jamboard questions. Take a sip of my coffee. Yeah, Mark.
Is there a partial for testing?
A partial for testing? Partials are only for views, so no. I would think of like for organizing tests and drying that stuff up. There's something in RSpec called shared examples, but we won't get into that in mod 2. Dougie.
Kind of following up on Molly's question, so it seems a little, I don't know if redundant's the word I'm looking for, to have a test for every single like possible page that the partial might be on. If you're trying to dry up your code by having the partial in the first place, isn't it like doing the opposite of what you want if you have to implement the same test on every view or every page that partial possibly could be on? Am I understanding that correctly?
Gotcha. So let me think about this. Yeah, that's a good question. We wouldn't want necessarily repetitive tests if this was like, say, an example that comes to mind for like, I think maybe what you're describing is if you're using a partial in the application.html.erb file and it's showing up on every page, does every feature test, like does the song index page have to test that content and the artist index page and et cetera, et cetera. I'd say that's probably less important, but I would decouple my thinking. I would suggest decoupling thinking from about testing and feature tests and user stories and site behavior and stuff like that from the use of partials, because yeah, those interactions and those flows might be separate, slightly different. So if you think back to the video where we had an example where we had to pass in different button text to the partial depending upon what page we were rendering it on, the feature test would maybe test something different, right? It would be testing that when you submit a creation form, you're clicking on the create artist button and then you're redirected to the artist's index or something like that. Whereas you might be using the same partial for the update, but the feature test for the update would then click on update artist and be redirected to the artist show page. So I would think of them as separate things. I would continue, we want to continue testing the behavior of the site as a user would experience it. We don't necessarily, if there's a partial that's used on multiple pages that is not different at all, we would just test each page in the context of like the user story. Was that helpful at all, or did that answer the question?
Yeah, that makes more sense to what I was trying to think.
Cool. Molly.
Yeah, I have a question about the forms. Like in some situations, or like maybe a lot of situations of the edit page, you'd probably be like filling in default values into your form. Is there a way, like, would you still be able to use the same partial to do that? Or like, I guess I'm curious about, like, that seems like a kind of a different case because there's a lot of stuff we're having to fill into the form. Or is it like, if you're just using a model in your form, like, can you still populate those default values while using the same partial for those two forms?
Yeah, you definitely can. And the solution that immediately comes to mind for me would be to pass in locals, just pass the instance variable that you have available for the model. And just be able to kind of use it the same way you would in any ordinary view that has access to that instance variable. There might also be other ways to just like pass a specific attribute off of that model to pre-populate it. In my mind, it kind of depends upon how complicated the form is. If you have 27 fields, you probably don't want to be typing out every single field in locals and have this giant hash of local variables that you send over, and it might be more efficient to just send that instance as a local variable. In other situations, maybe all you need to send is like a label for one field, like in the case of a search bar or something. And maybe then it just makes more sense to send that one local variable attribute. And we can dig into examples if that's helpful later, if it's something you want to implement.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So, but like you could send it in one case and not in another case is what you're saying. So you could like send that local variable in one form, but not in the other form.
Yeah, I believe that would work just fine. Especially if you're just sending like an attribute off of that instance variable, then you could, in the other case, just send like an empty string.
Okay.
I think it kind of is situational and depends case by case. So, but yeah, it's definitely possible to do it send it one time and not send it every time.
Okay, cool.
Is that clear? Can I clarify anything?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yes, and then I think I saw another hand go up. Oh, was it Jennifer? Was your question answered?
It was me, but I was retracting my question because I think it's silly. But just like there's no option to make like an application folder in spec and then have that contain a test that would test for partials on every page, just like when we do like the application layout that renders on every page. There's no option to do that, is there? Just to try.
I'm thinking about this in my head, trying to imagine what it would look like. It might be theoretically possible, but my feeling on that is I think it's still more valuable to test on a user story level, just to make sure you catch all the behavior. And maybe there's some like repetitive testing there, but in my mind, the trade-off is like trying to think about and maintain a whole separate area of testing for like where partials are showing up. To me, I just think that would be more cognitive resources to maintain than just testing the way that we're testing now, and maybe having some repeated assertions for like things that are showing up on different pages.
Thank you for preventing me from going down that rabbit hole.
No problem. That's a good question. Cool. I think, yes, I'm still sharing my screen, and I see this one other post-it note or this other Jamboard thing I wanted to get to. Do you ever use partials to clean up sections that are sometimes rendered, but only used on one page? So I want to kind of like repeat that question back and make sure that I'm understanding it right. So maybe the question is, can we implement a partial to just clean up a very complicated view without reusing that partial in multiple places? And the answer is yes. Maybe you can think back to Mod 1, learning about best practices for code styles and code conventions, and maybe hearing something along the lines of, oh, well, all your Ruby methods should be 5 lines or under. or should only go to 100 characters on a line or something like that. We can think about views the same way, where if it's getting too long and too verbose, it's worth tidying that up, even if we're splitting something into a different file. We're still tidying up that view. We don't necessarily have to reuse that partial. We can think of partials almost like helper methods, right, in a Ruby class. So that's how I would think of it. It's definitely fine to have a partial you only use one place. Other than for organization, are partials for security too? I can't think of any security reasons to use partials. I think a lot of the security stuff that Rails provides comes down to how forms work. So partials probably wouldn't be a part of that. They're more for us as developers to tidy things up and make them more readable and parsable and all that good stuff. Cool. Let me make sure I got to everything. I think I got to all these questions that are on the Jamboard. Is anything else coming up for y'all? Other questions, comments? I'm gonna catch up in chat. Lawrence.
Is there a, sorry, I was just looking at a piece and throwing it into partials, and I'm ending up with, just starting, I'm ending up with like 3 partials for this one page. Is that gonna be too much? Like, do you start to confuse your folder views? Or do you think it's more important to have a clean file than it is to have a clean, folder set, I guess?
File tree, yeah. I think that's kind of up to you. You can definitely accomplish everything you need to, like in this project, for instance, without any partials. I think it's something we recommend trying, but it's not necessary for the functionality. But then you can take it to like a very, you can break it out into very tiny pieces, right? I've seen people on like a show page, a complicated show page, maybe have 6 or 7 partials, but then that means that the show page is only 6 or 7 lines long. And I think where it starts to become, I think where the use of partials starts to become unnecessary or excessive is when you need to pass in so many local variables that it's almost like you're creating the new form all over again. I feel like that's a little bit too meta and actually makes things more complicated in the long run. But if you just have like 3 or 4 partials that you're not reusing anywhere else, they just exist in that same folder to clean up your view, I think that's fine. It just depends upon how you want to do it. Alex?
I have apologies if you've already answered this question, but am I incorrect in my assumption? It looks like there's only like one thing per file. Like you wouldn't have like a form and then another thing and then another thing, because then when you went to go do the partial, it would be like which one, right? Like, so it's just like one like essentially one helper method per file, right?
You're asking if we can call, I want to repeat this back, make sure I'm answering your question. You're asking if we can call multiple partials from the same file?
Yeah, essentially like when you do like render partial, oh, I guess it does say, no, because like the form doesn't have a label, right? It's just the one piece of information, like the one chunk of code in that file.
Right, so when we're calling render partial form, essentially what's happening on line 2 is we're inserting this other file. This is basically being rendered wherever we called render partial,
Right.
all of this. And then if I wanted to render another partial, I could do that. I could say like render footer or something like that. And then it would render this file here.
So, but in the form file, you would only have that. You wouldn't have like, and then another thing, and then another thing, right? It would just be one chunk.
Gotcha.
Right?
So when you say like one chunk and wouldn't have multiple things here, like, are you asking about like rendering more partials from this partial?
Yeah.
You can do that. I think I don't really know what conventions are around that. I know that I've seen it done here at Turing and in some of my jobs. And I think it could get messy and confusing because then you're trying to trace down exactly where the real form is, or maybe you're starting on like the page you're debugging and then you have to like traverse all these different partials that are being rendered from other partials. I guess my take on that, or my advice would be use your best judgment. It's definitely possible to render partials from within partials. And if it's getting confusing or it's more than a couple of layers deep, then maybe there's a better way to accomplish what you're doing. But it is possible. You can do that. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Cool. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. Does anybody have something like a partial that they're working on in their project that is giving them problems that they'd like to be brave and troubleshoot together? Okay, if there are no other oh, I see a hand. Sorry, Mark, let's take a look.
Oh, I actually have a question.
Okay.
For partials, the form, well, I guess like maybe this is not really a good question, but like the button, is that, I guess button is related to form, but I guess you can't do a partial for like link to or something like that? Or is that, am I just way off?
No, you definitely could. A partial can have whatever you want to have in it. It can just be like a paragraph tag. It can be a form and another partial. It can be a button to or a link to. Basically, it's just another HTML ERB page that you're calling on one line, and then you would go to another file to see the code that's within what you're rendering. So it can be any valid HTML ERB stuff. Does that kind of answer your question? Like you could make it a button. Cool.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, I think we have no more. We have a question, Lawrence.
Sorry, I was trying to get a cat off of my keyboard.
I know the struggle. Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll just keep this open until 10 o'clock. And if anybody has a question, just come off mute or raise your hand. We can work on project stuff that you have questions about, or if there are like things that you think of that we didn't get to on the Jamboard. Yeah, this next 30 minutes is just y'all's time to Q&A and debug as you see fit. So if you have more pressing things to work on, you don't want to work on partials right now, you can go ahead and leave the call and move on to regular project work time. But for those of you who do want to work on partial stuff, we'll keep this open until 10. Alex?
What would be a good, like a hint about like a good place where a partial might fit, so I can like conceptualize it? Because right now I'm like,
Gotcha. I think this might be something that multiple people are asking themselves. So would you mind sharing yours? Do you have your project handy? Could you share your screen and we'll just like poke around a little bit in the views? We can come back to you if you, okay.
Okay. Okay, so views. Here we are. Any particular?
So what I'd be interested in like seeing or hearing you talk about are areas that you think your views are just like doing too much, or if the file is getting really long, or if you think maybe there are a couple of different files that are doing something really similar. So I see you have your show open over here on the right. This seems like something that has a lot of stuff going on. So yeah, let's see.
I'm not sure if I have too much logic in here, but this is like, literally, this is what I was thinking about, but I wasn't sure because it doesn't necessarily repeat anything elsewhere. But I do think that you said something about it doesn't have to repeat. But yeah, this is a beefy file.
Yeah. So what kind of comes to mind for me is, and there are probably like multiple ways to clean this up and use partials to do that. So this is just like where I would start. I see some of these conditional statements. If pet application status is in progress, and then we have a form. So maybe that the form is something that you could pull into a partial, and then in your conditional, that cleans it up a little bit. You just have, if pet application status is in progress, render search form or something like that. And then when you come into the show page and you look at it with human eyes, you can kind of get an idea of what's going on, and you still get to extract that code into something else just to like clean it up a little bit. Same thing with like, if matching pet isn't nil, then maybe you can have a partial for pet buttons or pet links or something like that.
Okay.
So that's one place I would start, maybe just taking things out of conditionals and rendering partials in between those.
Cool. Awesome. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you so much.
No problem. Lawrence?
This feels a little redundant now, but I just basically did that, and I wanted to see if I'd done an okay job at it.
Okay. You want to share your screen?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. Let's do it. Nice. So you kind of have something similar going on, like you were saying, where we have a conditional, and then yes, this is kind of unrelated. I haven't really used this syntax with the then in an if statement. But if it's working, then no problem there. And then you have like render submit application, render pet search. Have you tested this out? Is it working? Okay, cool. And then, yeah, if you don't mind, let's just take a look at one of these partials. Cool. I would definitely also recommend, if you haven't already, walking through this in the browser and making sure everything behaves like you think it's going to behave. It might even be that you have access to your instance variable and you don't have to explicitly pass it as a local, which would be very nice. I'm not sure if that's true or not, so I would test it in the browser. But I think this is a great example of cleaning up your view a little bit. I don't see anything that I would necessarily change, especially because you're not reusing these partials, correct? You're only planning to use them on the show?
So this is the earliest bit of it, but yeah, so far just on this show page.
Cool. Yeah, I think if they're going to be static, like they don't necessarily need to be dynamic where you're changing the URL, you're changing the method, that kind of thing, then I think this is probably like, this is a good example of where you might not need to actually pass it any locals, because that's not going to change from place to place that you're using the partial if you're only using it in one place. Yeah, any like questions about this? I think it looks really good, but cool.
No, I probably will have some pretty soon, but for right now, I feel okay.
Nice. I was muted. Joe?
I have a non-partial related question, but it's something with Heroku that I can't figure out.
Okay, I'm happy to take that question and like time box it to 8 or 9 minutes, just in case other people have view stuff to talk about. Does that work?
Yeah.
Cool. So what's up with Heroku?
So when I was trying to migrate, basically I can't get my app to run, and this is the error I keep getting. I am on 7.2. 1 second, my keyboard has to connect. So I'm on 272. It won't migrate, and so I can't even load up my app. I spent like 2 hours looking for different commands on how to fix it, and I'm just stuck.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I feel like, okay, so you said you've been looking into some different commands. Have you looked into managing your gem file on Heroku? Basically, I don't know like if there's a better way to phrase that, but when you have changes on your local, I think Heroku is going to manage those separately, like the gem file and stuff, and there might be a command to run to get everything like bundled and up to date on the remote. Is that something you've looked into at all?
I feel like I might have, but I'm not sure. I was looking into a bunch of things last night, so it's kind of all blurred. But I can look into that. So does this seem like a problem where my gem files on my Heroku are different than what I have here locally?
Maybe. And based on the error, you were saying that your Ruby version is 272 right here, as you just like you said, Ruby-V, and it says your version is 272 and your gem file is specified 272. So my guess would be that on Heroku, for whatever reason, your Ruby version is different. So that's where I would start doing some research. I did a quick Google search and I'm not immediately finding the command that I think would seem familiar to me. But hopefully that gives you like a place to start troubleshooting.
Okay. I will look into that.
Hope that helps. Yeah, it does seem like it has something to do with the Heroku gem file or versioning. And there should be some Stack Overflow posts. I think that's a problem other people have probably run into at some point.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Natia?
So I've taken the partials in a direction that could be very bad.
Okay.
And I want to know if you saw in a project me doing what I'm doing, if you would be appalled.
All right, let's take a look.
Okay. So what I've got going on. Where are you? Where are you, partials? Here. Is I have made these like anything partials. Like it will do an index for anything. And let me see. So for example, in the, where am I using it? Shelters? Yeah. So like I have to pass it extra instance variables, but it will like show or index anything as long as in the show and index it has those things.
Okay, gotcha. So I think just off the bat, taking a look, it seems like the way that you're using partials is probably introducing more complexity than it is clearing up. That's just my gut feeling looking at the code. But I have a more specific question for you here, and that is about line 28. It looks like you're iterating over formatted attributes in that partial, but I don't see a need. Maybe you can like explain your process around this more. I don't see a need to be calling formatted attributes on every instance of shelter for a show page. Can you speak to that at all?
So like what this is doing is this is saying like, let's say this was an application, which has different attributes than a shelter, which has different attributes than a pets, right? So it's getting me like all the attributes and it's saying like, get me, I don't know, name and street address and like format them. So it's like capital N name, capital S street address split up, right? So like whatever it's doing, it's like giving me a set of formatted attributes so that in my partial, wherever it is. Let me get to show. Yeah, it just iterates, and every time it has like an attribute, it makes a table row for that attribute and then puts the value of that attribute in.
Interesting.
So if
Okay,
you
I
have like
see.
12 attributes, yeah, it does it 12 times. If you have 4, it does it 4 times.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes more sense now that you explain it. Yeah, what I'll say about this is it just like your logic checks out, but I did need you to explain it to me. So I think this is a little bit meta, and like it falls kind of like it's starting to get into the category of code that I would consider like meta programming, where we're abstracting things away so much that it's kind of hard to follow what's going on, because we're almost like, yeah, we're hiding what we're displaying to a certain degree, or we're abstracting what we're displaying, even for things like labels and table rows and fields and stuff like that. So I needed you to explain it to me. It's probably a little bit too meta in my mind. Though I will say it's also seems like it was a good exercise in practicing with partials, because you have like this outer directory where you're calling a partial that's not in the same directory where you're calling the render. Sorry, that I didn't say that well, but you get my point, I hope. Yeah, I think this is probably just introducing a lot of complexity. I wouldn't consider it conventional, and it kind of to me feels the same as trying to refactor the common CRUD actions in a controller to not have to type out like def index and then like record.all every time. It technically does dry up the code, but it doesn't necessarily make it easier for other developers to follow what's going on. So I probably wouldn't take it this far with partials personally. I wouldn't say I'm appalled. I'd just say it's a little bit too complex.
You would not want to see it in a project.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I needed to know. Thanks.
No problem.
Figure out if I can.
Let's see, Joe, is your hand up from before with the Heroku stuff? Thinking that's the other question. Okay. Lawrence.
Would you mind if we time boxed a really quick non-partials question?
Sure. I can't hear you.
This is for my join table.
Mhm.
And so I've got this params and error messages, but because they don't actually pass anything at any point, I'm not sure if I need these. Like I have an error here, but that's under the specific case that head's already on that application. So that's not something I can put in here. And because I don't know how to pass it bad params from, there's no way for a person to pass bad params by clicking or anything like that. So I don't know how to test these, or if I even need them in that case.
Yeah, my first question is, where are you calling application params?
It should be, well, I guess I'm not.
Yeah, I think that's why it's coming up as like untested. I think if you were doing something where you like, instead of saying at application equals application find params application, if you were doing something like params.require application permit pet and application, and then you would say application find application params, whatever, that would probably, yeah, I would say if you're not using the strong params, it's probably better to just not have them. And for the other question with the error messages, I think kind of same principle. If you're not calling that to get the full error messages from an unsuccessful save, then there's really not a need to have them. I will say like your code would probably be more resilient if instead of assuming that your error is always, I think you had a conditional there saying, if like this array is empty when I try to find this record with these two specific fields. If it were a more generic case of like the application not saving, then go find what the errors are with this helper method and display those. I think that would be more useful. If you like the way that your error handling is working now, you could probably just take out that method. Does that clear things up a little bit?
Yeah, it does. So that's not an error. If I can't, it only lets you add if it can't find that thing.
Yeah.
So the error is if it does find it, which I'm not sure, which should only happen in one case.
Right. So I would just describe that as like you're kind of hand rolling some custom error handling. It's not actually creating an errors object for the record you're trying to save. So that's why like you have no place to call that method, because you're not relying on those error objects.
And that's not, I guess my concern was then that I was doing something wrong, that it was bad to not use those. But if it seems to be working, and does that seem like an acceptable thing to do? Or
I think it's fine for functionality. The more conventional way to do it probably would be to write a validation on that join table model to make sure that the combination of those two fields is always unique, you know, like a unique pair of pet ID and application ID. And then that way, if the record doesn't save, then the error, like that validation will fail. Does that make sense? And then that validation should show up in your errors object, and then you could just call your errors object the way that your helper method is doing.
And I guess I spent a while unproductively struggling with that. I found a lot of ways to make sure that one or the other was unique, but then a pet could only appear on one application. So I wasn't sure how to find a unique joiner. Maybe that's just, I was asking the wrong questions, but that's where I was hitting my difficulty.
Got it. Yeah, I would maybe just like time box that research. If you have to keep it this way, then that's just, you know, that's how it is. But it would be an area of like potential refactor if you had time to really dive deep on like more complicated validations, I guess, is where I'll leave it.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Molly.
When you're like going through to start making partials on in your like directories, do you like, I guess I'm wondering about like organization convention or logic for like where something might belong or whether there's a reason to put it. So like, for example, my like pet search whatever thing that goes like on the like application show page, but it's also like on the pet index, whatever. Like, I guess, is there any reason like to put that like kind of Natia had in a separate partials folder because it's going in these two different places versus like putting in the pets folder because it like belongs proper there? Like, I guess like it will work anywhere. Like you can make it work anywhere, but I'm curious like whether there's a reason I might want it down the line in one of these places and not another.
Yeah, I think it does come down to personal preference, and I would lean towards putting anything that's going to be used in multiple directories in its own shared directory. I think to me, it's just easier to track things down if I know that there's a shared folder. But you could also argue, like you were saying, like this is really about a search for a pet, so it should go underneath pets, and then you can call that from any other directory. You would just like it, the render method will assume that you're starting at views. So you can just say pets search, and you can call that from like shelter or applications or whatever. I think that's totally valid, just as long as you're aware that's what you're doing and you have like a good reason for whichever option you choose. And I think on teams, it just comes down to the team's personal preference for how they organize stuff.
Okay, and it won't matter, like I'm struggling a little bit with like how the locals are getting called into that exactly. And so like, that's why I was like partly like the folder doesn't matter for what you're putting in there. It doesn't make a difference as long as there's like a variable in your partial and you're inputting that when you're rendering it.
Yeah, the locals are going to be determined at the time of the render. So as long as you have something available in whatever view you're calling the render in that you can pass down as locals, it will be smart enough to figure that out. Yeah, I'd say like the render method will assume it's looking for a file starting at the views level of the directory, and it will pass whatever locals you define when you call that render method. And presumably you're usually going to be getting those from whatever controller rendered that original view that you're rendering the partial from.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Natia, what's up?
I have a not completely related question, but how much like conditional logic in an HTML file is acceptable?
Gotcha. Just generally speaking, for how many if else statements or how many case statements or whatever for like the pure volume, I would follow the same rules as Ruby. So in Ruby, it would probably be considered bad convention to have like 7 else ifs, right? Or like a nested conditional could often be refactored, and it would be better to simplify that. So that would apply because we're still writing Ruby, right, in the HTML ERB files. The other thing is the type of conditional logic or what that conditional logic is trying to accomplish. That's the other thing I would consider. So if the conditional logic is trying to, or it has anything to do with like calling an active record method or like a class method, then that's an MVC violation just based on like the fact that it's data logic or business logic and not presentation logic. But to have, 3 or 4 on a page, if this is true about a record, display this button, I'd say that's totally reasonable. Does that answer your question, or do you have like maybe a specific example we could look at?
Yeah, I mean, I have an example. I think it like kind of answers my question in a way that like I'm like, I have to redo it now. But yes,
Sorry.
I could show you and see to what extent you want me to unwind this.
Okay. Yeah, maybe it would be good to just have some specific examples.
Okay, so the pets adopting.
Oh, okay.
Has like quite a few ifs.
So the first thing we're looking at is if the source is application, and I think this may go back to what you were talking about earlier with like breaking things out into partials, so you can use the new partial for any new, etc. So that one I would say is probably more related to that refactor that we talked about. The if pets adopting count is 0, then saying, hey, please add pets to your application. I think that's a totally normal conditional to have in a view. That has to do with what visual you're presenting, right? Then you're iterating over the pets. If they do have some, you're iterating over them and linking to them. I think that's also something I would expect to see in a view. And really, the more that I look at this, the more that I look at this, the main thing I would want to refactor out, or that I would suggest you refactor out, would be like the source piece. I think that is the primary conditional here that I would describe as unconventional. And then once you do that, you might get to this point and say, wow, this view is really long. Can I make a partial just for like the action and the status and shorten up this view?
Okay. Right. So then the question becomes like, neither like literally copy and paste these pieces into like the forms they're currently being called as partials, or just make them other partials just for the sake of cleaning up like the show page, right? Is that what you're?
Yeah, the second thing that you were saying, like just making a partial, like in this case, making a partial within applications and calling it like approval rejection or something like that. That could be just something that you have as a separate partial to clean this up a little bit. And right now, I think the other thing you were saying is that this is being called from a different partial, because you have like your partials directory and then the index, or no, this would be a show, I think, right?
Yeah,
so
page.
Yeah, I think yeah, I know I already said it, but I think the first thing that I would refactor is the very meta top level partials directory, and just like move all this back into your show page essentially for application. And then like create partials to break up this view a little bit more and just make it more readable. That's what I would do. All that being said, we're later in the project. It may or may not be worth your time to go through that big refactor of the partials directory at this point. Yeah, just something to keep in mind for next time, maybe.
Okay. And then one really, really fast question.
Sure.
Also completely unrelated. This is not making me a hash with all of these keys and values. And like, I forget mod 1 enough to be like, why? Like, I'm expecting a hash and I'm not getting one.
Can you show me where this is, where self.form fields is being called?
This is just like part of my like digging around with my monster.
Okay.
Which I just want to do just to say I, just do it. But
I think I don't see anything immediately like incorrect about your hash syntax. I think if you're calling this to like determine what the form is doing in your view, yeah, I think it would just be simpler and more conventional to rely on individual forms to set their own field types.
Yes, but it just keeps returning select. Like the whole thing is select. Does that seem suspect to you?
Field type hash is pet.form fields. So yeah, I think I'm starting to follow what's going on here. Could you instead put a binding.pry at the end of this method that you have open and run this again?
1 second. Yeah, this one.
That's not what I want.
Okay. Oh, so then when I call this,
So when you call this method, it's just going to return the default return value is the last line of the method. So you would just need to return this variable at the end.
amazing, thank you.
You were very close. Yep.
That one was so far away.
I would imagine it feels like months, months and months. Hey, Joe, what's up?
Could you look at my logs and see if maybe you could see the problem there?
Okay, yeah, happy to. Script start can be found in npm logs. Since this is mentioning npm, the only thing that I can think of is, did any of you, when you were setting up Rails for the first time, you had to do something like install node so that you had like some JavaScript for Rails to rely on essentially? Does that ring any bells?
I know that I didn't do that.
Okay.
And so I installed Node with this project. And that's when I started getting a bunch of problems.
Interesting. Okay. Have you Googled this? Actually, a complete log of this run can be found in app npm logs. But this is on Heroku, so I'm wondering how you would actually get to access that file.
Yeah, that's where I was kind of.
Can you click on the more drop-down menu over on the side where you get to the logs in the browser? This is probably beyond the scope of what I have time for at this moment, but what I would recommend is maybe DM me and Brian. I wonder if this is something that he has seen more often than I have, but yeah, I just don't think we have time to debug it. Right, I don't see anything like obvious when I look at your logs, but definitely follow up with us about it if you would like to.
Okay, yeah, I've just
Sorry.
been spinning my wheels with this for about 3 or 4 hours now. And it's not really productive towards this project at this point. So
Yeah, totally. I'll try to spend a little bit of time this morning doing some Googling around that as well. And if I find anything, I'll send it your way. But that specific error isn't ringing bells for me. So please remind me and follow up with us. And it's possible that Brian knows exactly what that issue is.
okay. And maybe for like a Google search, something like that NPM.
Yeah, maybe even because it was saying to see the full details of this error, open this file. I would maybe even like Google how to open Heroku npm log file.
Okay.
That's where I would start.
Right.
Cool. All right, well, I'm going to call it here. Thank you, everybody. If you have more questions about partials, views, or other stuff, as always, like just tag us in code help and we'll get back to you. So thanks for being here.